Hey, what's going on, everybody? Leigh Dickey here, and welcome back to another episode of the Beats and Speaks podcast. Before we get underway, I just want to get a little housekeeping off to where you guys are. I just want to tell you where you can find the Beats and Speaks podcast. Of course, you can find the Beats and Speaks podcast on my official website, leightdickey.com, on iTunes and Apple Podcasts. It's on Stitcher Radio, and it's on TuneIn, and everywhere else fine podcasts are available. You can also find the Beats and Speaks podcast on YouTube under Beats and Speaks. All those links will be in the description below. Be sure to subscribe, comment, like, and share. But without further ado, let's get into this latest episode of the Beats and Speaks podcast. All right. So, since it is October 1st to be exact, that means Halloween is right around the corner. It is 4 weeks away, as a matter of fact, 30 days. Actually, 4 weeks is just under 30 days, but you get the idea. Halloween is the next big thing for the world. Although I live in Canada, so the next big holiday for us is Thanksgiving. But that's another story for another time. That's coming before Halloween here. But we're talking about Halloween in this latest episode. And more specifically, my favorite things and my thoughts on Halloween and my memories of Halloween. So, like a lot of people, I started going out trick-or-treating when I might have been a year or two, maybe even younger. My parents started taking me out. I'm not sure. I've seen photos of a young me on Halloween, just going out in like the little sort of Halloween costume onesie that most parents get their kids dressed up in, or they'll put you in a small little jacket and just say, hey, boss, this guy's got candy and it's Halloween, so the thing to say is trick or treat. Go up to the front door and say it, and it'll give you free candy. Yay. I did that for several years. I mean, I went out from the time for as long as I can remember up until about the age of 12, so to speak. And it was when I got older, I got into like that little sort of strange in-between age where I felt a bit too old to be out as a trick-or-treater, as a kid, pretty much saying trick-or-treat and asking for candy. It felt really weird. And I found that out when I was about 12 years old. Because, I mean, the neighborhood that I live in, I've lived in this neighborhood and in this house that I'm living in now for about 21, almost 22 years now. And I grew up in this neighborhood, right? I grew up in this house. But over the last, say, 20 years or so, the neighborhood has basically taken a very sort of young approach. A lot of young families are moving into the neighborhood, and they have moved into the neighborhood, raised their families, and those kids have gone out on their own. But at the time of basically the last year I went out trick-or-treating, it was very, very, very young. I mean, I was like the tallest kid, and I'm not an imposing, tall, big guy. I'm probably about 5'6". I was the tallest kid going up to these homes saying trick or treat, and I felt really, really weird. Don't get me wrong, I love Halloween. I do. I love the fact, now that I'm older and I'm an adult, the thing I love about it most is, aside from the chocolate, because that's pretty much it, the chocolate and the candy, and welcome to National Cavity Day, pretty much all that is. Okay, this is, when you're an adult, Halloween is pretty much National Cavity Day, and it's an excuse to be an absolute glutton, for me anyway, with the chocolate and the candy and the treats and the whatnot. I mean, I love the costumes, don't get me wrong, and I love the fact that I get to see young families with their kids going around, coming out to homes in this neighborhood and anywhere else, and they're just enjoying themselves. They're having a good time. They're just having a good old-fashioned family outing, and they're enjoying themselves. They're having a good time. They're laughing. They're smiling. They're getting free candy. I mean, like, what more can you ask for on a night like Halloween, right? That's perfect. But back to my last night out as a trick-or-treater, which was back when I was 12, and that's more than a decade and a half ago now. But, you know, I felt really weird being the tallest kid there, probably one of the oldest, if not the oldest, to go out and go up to these houses and say trick or treat, and then having them basically hand over free candy, or, well, free cavities, if you will, because I go to town on sweets. Like, that's just another story for another time. I have a massive sweet tooth, so Halloween is like it's a surrogate Christmas for me, right? It's an excuse to just give me all the candy in the world, and I will just shove it down my gullet. But, you know, my last night out as a trick-or-treater, I just felt really, really weird. As an adult now, I love Halloween. I mean, I've always liked it. I've always had an appreciation for it, and the costumes and seeing the families out, just having a good time and getting all that free candy. Super, super cool. Like, I really, really, really enjoy that stuff. I mean, I don't have kids myself, and maybe one day if I have kids and start to decide to repopulate the world, you know, one kid at a time, of course, I will go out with them, and we'll go out trick-or-treating, and I'll give them all the free candy in the world, and then they'll deal with the cavities later, but that's half the fun. And, you know, after stopping going out as a trick-or-treater, after my last year going out as a trick-or-treater and getting dressed up in costumes and things like that, and that's another thing. I mean, as a kid, you look forward to getting dressed up. You look forward to the candy. As I got older, I mean, after that last night out as a trick-or-treater for me when I was 12, I decided that night that I wasn't going to go out anymore as a trick-or-treater. I wasn't going to go out the following year. I wasn't going to go out any other subsequent year after that, simply because it just felt really weird to me, and I really wasn't having that good of a time that I had in years past. I mean, the neighborhood was very different. The children were very young. The families were very young, and they were brand new to the neighborhood, right? So this would have been, you know, in the early 2000s. And a lot of young families started moving in to this neighborhood. And I've been in this house and in this neighborhood that I'm in now since, the mid-90s. So, I mean, over that 5-6 year span from the time I started trick-or-treating in this neighborhood to the time I stopped, a lot of young families came in. They had their kids. Those kids, you know, grew up and went on and lived their lives. But at that time, when I decided to stop going out, the neighborhood was still very, very young. I got home that night and decided that I wasn't going to go out the following year or any of the years after that. So what I did instead was I decided to hand out the candy, because once I got to about 12 and then decided that I wasn't going to go out anymore for Halloween, I realized that I didn't have to dress up. And as much as I love getting dressed up and done up in costume, and as much as I enjoyed that last year that I went out as a trick-or-treater, it seemed like a chore for me, right? It really shouldn't. Halloween is something to be enjoyed by everybody and for everybody. I mean, aside from the candy, you're spending time with your family, you're spending time with your friends, you're having a good time. It's pretty much a surrogate party night for most people now. And I wasn't feeling that the last year that I went out. I wasn't all that comfortable with it. I wasn't having fun, so I just decided to not go out anymore as a trick-or-treater. But the following year, and for 5 years after that, so from about the ages of 13 to about 18 or 19, I was handing out the candy, which was great for me because I got to, I was sitting on my porch. Of course, I had a jacket and a sweatshirt on, or a sweater, some jeans and some running shoes. I just felt I was very casual about it, when I would hand out the candy. It wasn't about getting dressed up for me anymore. It was just like these kids were still coming by, and the neighborhood was still at that point where the kids were young enough that they would still enjoy going out for Halloween, right? So the kids were coming by, I had the candy, and I was just handing it out. And sometimes some of the kids would come up, and I'd want to mess with them a little bit, because some of them would come up and it's, oh, trick or treat, sir. And I would, my response would be, oh, and a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year to you too. Some of them were a little taken back by it, but it was all in good fun, And the 5 years that I had, 5 or 6 years that I had spent handing out the candy, those were fun. Why? I didn't have to worry about getting dressed up. I didn't have to worry about going up to somebody else's house and knocking on the door, trick or treat, thank you for the candy, and on to the next one. I just had to worry about having the candy there, again, not eating it all. That's another thing. I mean, I've said earlier, I have a massive sweet tooth, so I would eat a lot of most of the product that I had, because not a lot of people would come by as it got later into the evening. So you're there sitting, I was sitting on my porch. I had the radio going. I had some CDs out. So I was listening to some tunes, which is another thing that was a saving grace for me on those days, or at least on Halloween, where I would sit there and just listen to my favorite tunes and my favorite songs and my favorite radio stations back then. And I would enjoy myself in a whole different way. I'd keep myself entertained. And I just wait for the kids to come by, and their families and their parents. I remember one specific, there were a few times in the years actually, but I remember it might have been the last year that I handed out the candy. I think I was about 18, and this kid might have been, 1 or 2 years old, something like that. And he and his parents passed my house. But this kid, he looked up at my porch, and I had the porch light on, but that was the only light that I had on, other than the lights that were on in the living room. And I'm standing there, and I see them stop, right? So his parents are trying to get this little boy to walk up my driveway and come up my steps, but he's frozen, basically. He won't do it. He will not walk up my driveway and come up my steps. I mean, granted, even for a guy like me, it can be a bit of a daunting task to walk up my driveway and up my steps, but that's only because I have a walker, and, well, I've mentioned that several times, that I have to carry my walker up my steps to my porch, in through my front door, and then we go on about our nightly activities and things like that, like dinner and watching a little TV and such. But this little boy was probably a year or two. He was walking, and he and his parents stop in front of my house. They're trying to get him to come up to me, because I'm standing at the top of my porch, and I'm the guy with the candy, right? But he just won't do it. So you know what? To make it easier on the kid, because we've all been that small, and our legs have all been that stubby, I decide, you know what? because he's scared, obviously, to come up to my house because A, it's dark. The only light I have on is the porch light. And at the time, I basically had a shaved head, so I guess I looked scary. I mean, I had a natural costume. I just shaved my head bald, and I had on a big jacket and some jeans. So to make it easier on this kid, I went down my steps and basically walked down my driveway to meet him and his parents on the sidewalk just in front of my house. And I said, "Here you go, boss." And I probably gave him more than I'd given any kid in the neighborhood at that time. I probably reached in. I probably reached in and gave him some extras after he reached in and got one or two pieces. I said, "Here, boss, take about half the basket," because I just wanted to make that kid's Halloween. I wanted him to remember my house and think, you know what? That guy was cool, or he made my Halloween, things like that. I doubt that specific kid thinks that specific of me, but I just wanted to make that kid have the night of his life. I wanted him to be happy. I wanted him to have the most candy out of anyone in his family or any of his friends at that point, if he had any. I'm sure he did. But I wanted that kid to be super, super happy because, it looked like it could have been his first Halloween. So I wanted that night to be memorable for him, and that's why I walked to him instead of having him walk to me, right? Because obviously if he's frozen at the top of my driveway, he's not coming up my driveway and up my steps to come see me to get the candy. All right, we'll go to him because he's scared or he's not sure what to do. So I'll go to him and I'll give him the most candy that I've probably given anybody in one shot. That was a cool year. Granted, it was the last year I did it because life got in the way and I was preparing. I think that was my last year of high school. So at the time I was preparing for college and university and just important life things. Like I was going to graduate, I was going to go on to college, I was going to go on to university and try and make something of myself. Yay, that's always fun. Okay? I was going to go out and be an adult. Yay, right? So that's probably one of my favorite memories of Halloween. Like I remember sitting out front of my old house, which isn't that far from where I currently live, just handing out the candy. And this would have been 1995-ish. So this is probably a year before we moved into the house that I'm in now. And I was a big fan of the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, right? What 90s kid was not a fan of the Power Rangers? I grew up in the 90s, and that was one of the things that was on TV. So, obviously, it was a thing, and I was a kid then, and pretty colors and a lot of action, a lot of adventure. That's perfect for a guy of my age, right? And I was dressed up as one of the Power Rangers for Halloween, and I was sitting on my steps because walking for me for lengthy periods of time was not a good idea. Like, I've got a 20-minute gas tank, and then that's it, man. I got to pop a squat. We got to sit down somewhere. Thankfully, my walker comes with a seat, so that's not much of a big issue now. I can just turn the thing around and sit down myself. But back then, I didn't have one of those. And I didn't really use any assistive mobility devices back then because they weren't really all that readily available, and they were much more expensive than they are now. Don't get me wrong, they're still expensive, but they were much more expensive back then. But I remember just sitting on my porch and just watching these kids come to the house. And I remember back then The second the sun went down, from about, I'd say, 5 o'clock to maybe 11:30, kids were out and we were handing out candy. Like, our house and the block that we lived on at that time was gangbusters, right? With kids just coming up to your door, knock, 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 trick or treat, handing out candy for probably 6 hours straight, something like that, 5-6 hours straight. It was beautiful. Not that this neighborhood that I'm in now doesn't have that, although I haven't seen much of that in recent years, but maybe it'll pick up. I don't know if a lot more young families move into the neighborhood with kids or have more kids, then maybe we'll have that again. But those are just some of my Halloween memories. A lot of fun, I'm actually glad that I stopped trick-or-treating when I did, because like I said earlier, I felt weird even going out trick-or-treating at 12, being probably the tallest and one of the oldest kids going up to houses and asking or saying trick-or-treat and then getting candy. It just felt really weird to me. And I remember like the year after I stopped, there were some kids probably about 13, probably about my age, that came up to my porch, and even I thought, I'm like, aren't you guys a little old for this? Because, they were my age, maybe even a year or two older, and it was just like, aren't you guys a bit, like, isn't this a bit above your pay grade, boss? Like, aren't you a bit too old for this? That's what I thought when I was probably about 13. I thought I was too old at 12, because I really wasn't having a good time with it, being surrounded by nothing but little kids all night. And when I was 13, started to hand out the candy for a little while, and I got like teenagers coming, people my age and a bit older coming up to my front door, trick or treat and whatever. I couldn't help but think that these kids were a bit too old for that. Maybe that's just me. Maybe that means I'm becoming an old man, or maybe that means I became an old man very, very early on in life. I'm not sure. I just thought that it was a little weird. But those are my memories of Halloween. Good times, good memories, a lot of candy, a lot of cavities, but I have zero regrets. What are some of your memories of Halloween? Let me know. Comment, like, share, and subscribe. Subscribe to the Beats and Speaks podcast on iTunes and Apple Podcasts, Stitcher Radio, TuneIn. Find it on my official website, LeighTDickey.com. Subscribe to Beats and Speaks on YouTube as well. But that's it for this episode of the Beats and Speaks podcast with Leigh Dickey. I have been your host, Leigh Dickey. And of course, we will see you all and talk to you all in the next episode. All right, Leigh Dickey for the Beats and Speaks podcast and Beats and Speaks on YouTube, LeighTDickey.com. Signing off. We'll see you all later. All right, I'm out of here. We'll talk soon. Peace.